So the forebrain is the most anterior and prominent part of the mammalian brain. So we've already talked about the hindbrain that contain the pons, the medulla, and the cerebellum. We talked about the midbrain. Now we're going to talk about the forebrain. And it consists of the cerebral cortex, which you can see here, and then all the subcortical regions which are hidden underneath. The forebrain consists of two cerebral hemispheres, so two separate hemispheres that receive sensory information and controls motor movement from the opposite side or the contralateral side of the body. So again, we'll come back to the cerebral hemispheres and the cerebral cortex and the lobes of the cortex momentarily or in a separate video. For now, we're going to talk about the subcortical structures. So the subcortical structures of the forebrain that we're going to talk about include the thalamus, the hypothalamus, the amygdala, and the hippocampus. So the thalamus you see here in the center of the brain. The hippocampus is not pictured on here, but it would be somewhere around here. The hypothalamus sits just below the thalamus, and the amygdala is also not pictured here, but it sits very close to the hippocampus. Now, while I'm going to show you the anatomy in the video, I'm not going to hold you responsible for knowing the location. I won't ever give you a drawing and say, identify these on a quiz or a test. I just think that for some people, for me in particular, knowing the location of a brain region helps with understanding the function. The first region we're going to talk about is the thalamus, and it sits here nicely in the middle of the brain, allowing it to complete its main function that we're going to talk about, and that is acting as a relay station from the sensory organs to the brain. As that incoming sensory information comes in from our eyes, our ears, our mouth, our skin, it comes up via the cranial nerves or the sensory nerves up into the brain, and it relays in the thalamus before going off to its appropriate cortical region. When I was in graduate school, the professor that was doing a brain dissection referred to it as the Jesus of the brain because it's all-knowing, especially about those sensory systems. Some other analogies I've heard since is that it's like a traffic cop sitting there in the center of the intersection, or here, the center of the brain, directing that incoming sensory information to the correct position. And if those don't work for you, I've also heard it as kind of the router of the brain. Now, while we know there's a lot of incoming information coming into the thalamus and sending that information out to the cortex, anatomical studies suggest that more than 50% of the connections coming into the thalamus don't originate just from sensory receptors in the periphery, but actually from the cortex, allowing the thalamus to prolong and intensify reactions. In addition, when I was studying Wernicke-Korsakoff syndrome during my master's degree, we were looking at damage in the thalamus, and remember that disorder involves amnesia or severe memory impairments. So the relaying of sensory information is just one important function of the thalamus. So here again, just showing you the thalamus, showing an enlarged version, showing you that it has different groups of neurons. So when we call something a nucleus, like here the dorsal median nucleus, the ventrolateral nucleus, that word nucleus means that there's a group of cells that work together for a common function. And so we name those specifically and kind of separate them out in areas like the thalamus. And you can see it has incoming information, it has outgoing information. And so the thalamus, again, plays many roles in behavior, but for this class, we'll just talk about it as relaying that sensory information. All that sensory information except for the sense of smell. So the hypothalamus is this small area that sits underneath the thalamus, and it's a small area near the base of the brain. It's going to convey messages to the pituitary gland, which kind of dangles down here, and it alters the release of hormones. So the pituitary gland makes some of its own hormones. Some of the hormones that the pituitary gland releases are made in the hypothalamus and sent to the pituitary gland, but ultimately the hypothalamus tells that pituitary gland when to release those hormones. And remember, the pituitary gland is an endocrine gland that releases hormones into the bloodstream, and those hormones then travel a great distance, or can travel a great distance, to have their effect. The hypothalamus is also associated with emotions and drives that are vital to survival. So when we talked about the medulla, we talked about vital reflexes. Those are things that are reflexive, like breathing, heart rate. Here we're talking about drives that are vital to survival. Now, while breathing is important for survival, these are drives. So things like fear, hunger, thirst, reproduction. So all of those things are drives, motivated behaviors that we need to survive as a species. The hypothalamus also regulates temperature, the autonomic nervous system, and many of our other biological clocks besides temperature and sleep. The amygdala, which sits here right at the kind of the end of the hippocampus, is involved in arousal. We also know it plays a role in emotion, maybe the regulation of emotion. Because of this, it seems to have a role in anxiety and depression. It's also been shown to be involved with emotional memory and intelligence. And while research does show that it has some sort of role in our fear and our fear learning. So when I think of the amygdala, I think of the fear response. I think of that fear conditioning, but it does appear to play a role in other types of maybe emotional memory and intelligence. There are some neuroscientists out there that don't really think that certain structures are kind of pegged for a specific emotion. So while it may play a role in that fear response, it's probably not the only area responsible for fear. But for the purposes of this class, when you think of the amygdala, you can think of emotion, fear, arousal, and then it does seem to play a role in anxiety and depression. When you think of the hippocampus, you want to think of memory. So it's critical for storing certain types of memory. And the hippocampus sits here in the temporal lobe, which we'll talk about the lobes of the cortex in the next video, but it sits here in the temporal lobe, specifically the medial temporal lobe. So the hippocampus is important in storing new information, so new memories. Now, while it's not necessarily for all types of memory, and we'll differentiate between those types of memory later on, when we think of the hippocampus, specifically you want to think of that episodic memories. So the hippocampus is also going to compare incoming sensory information with the brain's expectation of the world. So the idea is that as we are bombarded by all these new sensations, we decide what to kind of attend to, and as that information comes into the hippocampus is going to decide, is this new information? Do I need to form a new memory? Do I need to encode this separately, or do I need to modify an existing memory? Some neuroscientists would say that kind of helps us with the predictions that our brain makes. And so again, think hippocampus, think memory. Here I have just a little picture of my oldest when she was, probably 2. And this is just a fun memory, an episodic memory. And this is something that the hippocampus would have encoded. And we'll learn in a subsequent video when we talk about memory that over time that those actually gets moved into the cortex for storage. We know the hippocampus is also important in the formation of spatial memories, so helping us navigate our environment,